Dear ladies and gentlemen, this is the very exciting moment. I hope you're all getting ready for this. This is the moment you probably have all been waiting for the last 2 years. The results of the new Gender Equality Index will be revealed momentarily. I'm curious, though. As you know, all the countries are being ranked. They get scores. Which countries do you in the audience think has improved or have improved the most? Just please shout out some names of your personal favorites for the gender equality champion of the last 2 years. France. Spain. Greece. Are people all going with their home countries right now? Malta, all right. Anybody else want to take a guess here before we reveal this? Unfortunately, or on the other side of the spectrum, there are countries that make progress. My question to you is, do you believe there are countries that also make regress, where they have a lower score as compared to our last edition 2 years ago? Who of you thinks some countries at least have lower scores today than they did 2 years ago? Just raise your hand for that. All right, so the rest of you thinks they at least stayed even or made some progress. Well, we're about to find out. And for that, I would like to ask Blandine Mollard to the stage. She's a research officer at EIGE, and she will give us the overview of the 2019 Gender Equality Index. Blandine, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Good morning. It's really wonderful to see so many of you today. I was reading the news lately and I was thinking to myself, wow, we have been hearing some very powerful voices pushing for greater equality lately. From Tamara Brook, who started the historic global Me Too movement to speak out against sexual violence, to Greta Thunberg, who, despite the sexist hate she's getting online, has managed to mobilize millions of people around the globe to demand action on the climate crisis, to, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, who is not only the first woman elected president of the Commission, but also the first president so far to have brought gender balance to one of the leading spaces of power of the EU. But maybe some of you are thinking, yeah, this is very well, this has happened for sure, but how much of this progress is actually making a difference in individuals' lives? How much of this positive progress is reaching all Europe? And more importantly, even more, how much of this progress is enough to counter the rise of anti-gender movement who wants, as Monica said, to roll back some of the gains that we've made in the past decades? For all of those questions, I'm very excited to present to you the Gender Equality Index results 2019. I'm sure most of you have a copy of the index report on your bedside table, but I will still want to refresh your memory with the structure of this tool. As you know, it was launched in 2013. It's a composite indicator made of 6 core domains. Each domain is made of individual-level indicators who measure how individual women and men are faring in 6 aspects of their lives: work, money, knowledge, time, power, and health. Alongside those 6 domains, we have 2 additional domains. One is about violence against women. As Virginia said earlier, this score is not updated this year. We are very eagerly awaiting the next results of the EU-wide survey on violence against women produced by Eurostat. And the last one is the intersectional approach. For each indicator in the index, to the exception of power because of data availability, we have the possibility now to see beyond the effect of gender, how gender combines with other characteristics. For where it may be level of education, your level of your age, whether or not you have a disability, what is your migration status, your family composition. So this is one of the aspects that we bring a bit of a richer analysis to the Gender Equality Index. And the index then comes to a score about from 1 to 100. So pretend you haven't seen the slide. We have seen, now we have data from 2005. So we are actually able to take a step back when it comes to the Gender Equality Index and imagine what kind of progress we have seen since that date. So maybe some of you remember 2005. Maybe you were already established in your career, you were already pushing for pay equality, pushing for prevention of gender-based violence. Maybe you were a teenager, not sure what to do with yourself in a gendered environment. Anyway, how much of progress do you think the EU has done since 2005? How fast, how slowly have we progressed, in your opinion? Slow? Okay, I will give you a hint. We have called it snail pace. So the EU has progressed only by 5.4 points in 12 years. It's not exactly a very impressive line. Since the last edition, the EU has gained 1.2 points in the Gender Equality Index score. So this is very marginal progress. This is very modest progress. So the EU score collectively has increased by 1.2 points since the last edition. But let's have a look at this progress, of course, is very diverse across countries. We see some countries who have improved much more than that. In particular, I want to highlight 6 countries for their particular progression. We can see that Portugal has increased by 3.9 points, Estonia 3.2, Croatia 2.5. Unfortunately, some countries have regressed. Vincent has asked you what you think could be those countries, and unfortunately, when we look at Poland, the score has decreased by 1.6 points, bringing back the progress that had happened since 2005. In the past 2 years, Poland has lost all the gains in the index gained from 2005. My host country, Lithuania, has lost 1 point since the last edition. Netherlands, 0.8 points. Since we mentioned specific country progress, I think it might be time to reveal the scores of the Gender Equality Index. As you can see, all of the countries, regardless of where they sit on that chart, have room for improvement when it comes to gender equality. It can be different challenges that face different countries, but every single one of them has to improve in some way. At this moment, you can see that the EU score is 67.4. We have a third of EU member states who are below, who are more than 70 points. So that's very encouraging. But we also have half of the countries below 60 points. And that's not so encouraging. You can see that the leading countries for this year's index are Sweden and Denmark. They have been the leading countries since 2005. Some countries have lost ranking, especially the Netherlands. Looking at the scores qualitatively, what kind of domains are leading the index? We have the domain of power lagging behind, only 51.9 points. The domain of knowledge, the domain of time are the ones who have the lowest score. There has been some improvement in money, in work, and health remains the highest scoring domain for the whole index. So on the basis of those scores, we have identified some themes who are either stalling gender equality, constituting obstacles to progress, or actually constituting a catalyst to progress. I'm sure those themes are really not coming as a surprise to you. The first one is gender segregation. Virginia mentioned the story of her friend trying to break into the field of a new occupation, electrician, and the challenges that she faced. Gender segregation is a pervasive problem for most countries, and it is reflected in the lower score of the knowledge domain and the work domain. So the fact that women and men study and then have careers in most of them traditional occupations is one obstacle for gender equality. It has ramifications for the gender pay gap. It has ramifications for women's economic independence. Another theme that we have identified, again, not a big surprise, is the gender norms around care. The fact that the time domain reflects the weight of the unpaid work, the burden of unpaid work falling mainly on women, is an indication of how much of an obstacle this is to achieve other things in other fields, including political representation. I've also included the intersecting inequalities logos, because across all the domains, what we're seeing is that gender gaps are systematically higher among couples with children. So we see that the impact of caring, and you will hear more about that later when we go into the work-life balance discussion, the impact of family responsibilities is really disproportionately borne by women. The last one is, of course, inequalities in pay. They affect women all along their life course with a cumulative effect. We see now in the EU that 1 older woman in 5 is at risk of poverty. The pension gap is a very important problem that results from all the career breaks, the inequalities in pay all along the life course. But what is also accelerating gender equality? We have also identified that one key domain in particular is a catalyst, is driving actually the change that we are seeing at the moment. It's the domain of power. We can see that gender balance in decision-making may it be on economic power, political or social, is making the highest contribution to the gender equality score, to the improvement of the score. This is the thick line is the evolution of the power domain since 2005. It's not very striking because I wanted to keep the scale from 20 to 100 so that you would see that it's actually still lagging behind. The score is nothing to be really proud of. It's 51.9. But it is actually increasing much faster than other domains. The economic power, the political power have increased a lot. 23 members of 23 countries have seen an increase in the domain of power. Unfortunately, 3 countries have also seen their score of the domain of power decreasing. Those are Lithuania, Netherlands, Poland, and Slovenia. What we are seeing when we analyze the domain of power and the gains is that they are extremely linked to the adoption of legislative quotas. We clearly see the impact of legislation on the scores of the countries, on the participation of women in national parliament, in the board of largest companies. This is absolutely clear. In this edition, we wanted to analyze if EU countries are coming together on gender equality or if they are growing further apart. So we applied a very interesting analysis, which is the convergence analysis on the basis of Eurofound methodology. And we've identified different scenarios that countries have taken. The first one, as you can see, that 9 countries have shown, is the catching up. So you see countries who, I just put Malta as an example, countries whose score were below the EU average have progressed more rapidly than the EU. So they are they are catching up with the EU average. This is the case for the 9 countries listed there. There is another trend that we noticed, is the flattening. So for countries who had a bit of a higher score, their scores have progressed not as fast as the EU average. So they are getting closer to the EU. And the third main scenario is the slower pace for countries who are among the ones with the lower score. They are improving, they are getting better on gender equality, but not as fast as the EU average. So the distance is growing more important from the EU average. There is another scenario only affecting 3 countries, is outperforming, and 1 country has been diving, so growing further apart from the EU average, and that's Lithuania. As Virginia said, we rely absolutely on comparable data for the Gender Equality Index existence. Without reliable, robust data, we cannot provide this analysis and be absolutely certain of what we're saying. So we take this opportunity to thank our main data providers, especially Eurostat, Eurofound, and FRA. And I wanted to raise your attention to the fact that we have produced also country-specific analysis. So there are some fact sheets for each country that you can really see the analysis of your score, of the progress of the country, what are the challenges existing. And my colleague here sitting in the corner knows all the details by heart. So if you have any questions, he will be very happy to answer any question. So the results are telling us that, yes, actually there has been some progress. Europe is getting a little bit closer to gender equality, but not everywhere, not in every aspect, and clearly not fast enough. Some categories of women and men are seeing their situation deteriorating, their prospects for the future looking quite grim. So this is clear that if we want to keep those gains and gain further progress, we need to keep working. We need to keep working hard until we reach the finishing line. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Blandine. Well, here you have it. You got the 2019 score of Gender Equality Index, and that's something we want to discuss with very fortunately very knowledgeable and very expert speakers who will bring a variety of perspectives onto the subject. So we'll open our first panel discussion or session with the title, "Is Gender Equality in the EU Moving at a Snail's Pace?" And you will all probably say yes, but we want to discuss a little bit why that's the case, how we can improve it, and what we can do. And we're very excited for our 4 speakers. I will just ask all of them to the stage right now. Also, Mira and Blandine, if you want to join us again. We have with us Evelyn Regner, who is the chair of the FEMM committee with the European Parliament. Tiina, Astola, the Director-General, DG Justice and Consumers with the European Commission. Joanna Maycock, the Secretary-General of the European Women's Lobby. And Carina Autengruber, President of the European Youth Forum. Thank you so much for all of you to be here. Yes, and while we all get seated, the reminder, you can ask questions on Twitter. Just be sure to use the hashtag EIGE Index. Mira will view the Twitter feed a little bit, so if she spots very interesting questions that fit well with the panel, she will address them on stage. If you do not have Wi-Fi, you can just use the Wi-Fi that is freely available here, so you should be able to be well connected. Well, let us get started. I think what I'm most curious, particularly with the 4 of you, is to hear your first reactions to the results, what you think about, what you've seen, what you've heard, what that indicates. We have these handheld microphones for you. Who would like to jump in first with a first thought on the 2019 index?
Okay, we're going.
Great.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for presenting the index. I remember being here 2 years ago and being really exciting when I saw the presentation and then the data. Then, of course, the first thing for me is to really thank EIGE for this. It is so important that we have this crucial evidence with which we can then work, with which we can promote knowledge about gender inequalities. And it's very important for the Commission so that we see where the difficulties are, where the difficult tasks are, but we also will see the progress. So I really want to say how important this is. Snail space, yes, this is what it is. But I think this is, it's difficult because this is about us. It is about the gender stereotypes, which are still so, I think, deep in men and women. And we heard the example that Inga gave us. And I think we all find that. And therefore, I think the important thing is that we really have the facts. You mentioned the segregation as being one of the most difficult issues. I come from Finland, and there we see that the professions are really still segregated. For instance, IT field, very much governed by men. So I think this is what we have to work with, the stereotypes, which is, of course, very, very difficult. And here I think the fact that von der Leyen has put the gender issues as a main theme for the incoming Commission is important, and having a strategy where we can look at the wide range of issues and also very strongly the stereotyping. I maybe took it a bit too long, but I'll pass.
No, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and excellent good morning. I was also eagerly listening to the news right now presented, and of course there are always some little surprises, but on the other hand, I think one get a little bit of feeling when you look at the political landscape, how the European Union as such is developing, and insofar the surprises are not so big. First of all, it's always good to see progress, even if it's very slow progress, and we talk about snails tempo. But when we just look at the data on the political and economic power issues, decision-making, we see some progress. Of course, at a very low level, because here a lot has to be done. And this is good. And therefore, when I'm just looking around to countries who had done something and countries who are more or less leaning back, we always see binding measures. Wherever there are binding measures, we see some progress in all fields. And when we have to deal with legislation or political attitudes or a society who thinks everything should be done on this voluntary basis, and then, of course, sometimes if you're lucky, there is some progress by some especially good examples, but in general, you see there is a fallback situation. And another somehow just observation I can see when I just look to the countries who are going with good speed into the future, looking to the winner, Portugal, we see, I mean, isn't that a package of measures, of governments who take into consideration the whole gender mainstreaming issue? So you have to look at all fields, and then you can also look at education, then you can look at decision making, then you can look at health and everything where you see some progress as such. And there, in those countries where generally spoken also fundamental rights are in danger, the rule of law, the whole political issue, you see always also the whole field of equality that is suffering, and we have a fallback situation.
Joanna.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just got to start by saying what a fantastic job all the team at EIGE does. So congratulations really to Virginia and all the team. This index is a phenomenal tool, and really powerful. And it's something that we in the women's movement look to and use to inform our work and our demands. And I only wish that all decision makers were using it as a tool for decision making, because as Evelyn just pointed out, we know what works actually, and we can see what works, and we can track where there are binding measures, how that impacts actually on the data over time. The progress is extremely disappointing, if you can even call it progress. I think we can just say at least it hasn't gone backwards, but it it really has stood still. Let's not forget there's no single country in the European Union that has achieved equality between women and men, gender equality. There is not one single domain that is being looked at that has even got close to equality. There is so much work to do. And we think also that the reasons for that, we've talked here about the deep stereotypes in the labour market, in the care economy. We also think that austerity has played a huge role. We think austerity has been a disaster for the European Union on every possible level, social, political, economic. And it has been a particular disaster for women and for women's rights. The brunt of the cuts to public services and infrastructure have come directly from women's jobs, from women's pockets, and from women's access to the labour market by cutting back essential public services. And make no mistake, that has come particularly at the cost of poorer women, of women of colour, of migrant women, of women with disabilities and other minorities. So we think, yes, there's an issue about stereotypes, but there is an issue about the right kinds of public policies, and austerity certainly isn't that. What we need are concerted efforts by all EU member states to take binding measures, and we need an end to the disaster of austerity and to start really seeing about the importance of investing in quality public services through a gendered lens. We can perhaps talk a bit more about that as we get into the work-life balance package, but that's our general assessment.
Carina?
Well, for me, as a person who is representing young people in Europe, I think that there is this very slow or this lack of progress, I think is very worrisome, and I think it's very demotivating as well. I will be for the next 30 years, 40 years still in the labour market. I will see how politics is developing, and as it seems how the current progress or this lack of progress is looking, I will have a lot to demand in the next decades as well. So I think for us this is absolutely, snail pace is not okay. It's absolutely not okay. We as young persons, we as young people are expecting more. We don't have the time to wait for progress, but we want progress right now. I don't want to be part of another generation who keeps saying to the next generation, listen, in some years, in some decades, we will be there, knowing that most likely it won't be the case. So I think there is way more that member states, but also the European Union as a whole need to do as well. And I think it starts as well like from measures such as having a place where gender equality ministers are meeting on a regular basis as well, because this is currently not the case. And I'm asking why we're speaking about a very crucial topic, but it's not being put on the political agenda as well. And I don't understand where this political reluctance is coming from.
Carina, let me just stay with you for a second. You're president of the Youth Forum for one more year in a few months. How are you planning on using this new index somehow to, advocate even more with the Youth Forum as an organization vis-a-vis the European institutions for gender equality? How do you perceive your work, and can you use the index as a tool to promote more gender equality, particularly among young people?
I mean, first of all, it's absolutely important to have data, because only when we have data available, we can also implement quality policies as well. So this is an absolute starting point for us as well, and how we can engage and how we can improve the current political situation as well, and where we find ourselves. So I think it's definitely something we can use in our work as well, and build our policies as well to ensure that we also can achieve change as well.
Evelyn, I have a question for you. Joanna brought up that she wishes more people, more decision makers, political decision makers, were aware of the index or would show up for the conference. You're from the Parliament. What do you perceive there? Is the index a big point of discussion? Tomorrow, will everybody in the hall of the Parliament talk about the new index? Or do you also wish that there was more attention to this?
I'd love to. I'm a bit more optimistic concerning the future Commission, because not only because Madame van der Leyen intended that we have a gender-balanced Commission. I mean, they still have to work on that. There are some hearings missing. I just would like to remind all of you to stick here to the point. But when we started with the hearings to the commissioners, everybody had got this question, okay, what's your motivation, what you want to do with your portfolio? And everybody also had to answer the question on gender equality, on equality, on gender mainstreaming. What will you do in your job with your portfolio? What will you implement? So somehow we have women in agriculture, energy poverty. So just somehow passing through to all the commissioners. And here you need the data that cause inequality. And the commissioners, the designate commissioners, some of them were just really quite, I mean, they hardly answer, but the majority of them took it really serious. And answering something seriously you can only do if you really use data. If you use data, you can compare. If you can really look at something that has substance. And insofar, I think we got today and all the years before absolutely valuable material to work on. And this commission, I mean, I can only try to be optimistic, but I'm really sure this commission will be far more committed. And we in the European Parliament, we are the same way. Of course, you have different committees. Every committee works in a different way. But it's here the same thing, just with this responsibility of gender mainstreaming in all committees. In all committees, everybody has to look also on the data, the basis on comparing why inequalities exist. And insofar, I am on the one side quite optimistic because the tools we have are improving. And on the other side, of course, we also have to look very much to the situation as it is. You always have to look like how the European Parliament is composed of, how the Commission is composed of, how the governments look like in some countries. And the more nationalistic policy you have normally, also the less friendly concerning gender equality, politically responsible persons are acting.
You want to say something, Joanna?
Yeah, please. We also share some optimism. It's always good when there is a moment of change and transition. And it is really significant that there are now 40% of members of the European Parliament who are women, that a commission has been proposed that is almost equal numbers of women and men, that there is the first ever woman president of the European Commission. This is extremely significant to us. I arrived in Brussels in 1992. I was very young at the time, but I entered the labour market at that time, and I can assure you Brussels was all men. The Commission, I think there was one woman out of 15 commissioners at that time. So things are improving, and we do see that. And we see that this particular moment of transition has shown a real step forward. And we expect and hope and will be demanding that that has an impact on the political engagement around equality between women and men. The last 5 years, it has been really, really hard to make any kind of progress in the EU. Monica earlier pointed out some areas where legislation has been proposed, and we really welcome the introduction of the work-life balance package, for example, which will have a very meaningful and real impact on the lived lives of people across the European Union, and will really impact on the sharing of care responsibilities between women and men. I was in Denmark a couple of weeks ago visiting my members, who were excited and enthusiastic about the impact that legislation will have on the balance of care between women and men in Denmark. So it's really having an impact. What we expect now is a full and ambitious political strategy to achieve equality between women and men. The last 5 years, we did not have that. The last Commission failed to deliver that, and instead had a staff working paper that just simply does not give the political weight required for this kind of priority area, which has been in the heart of the European Union's values since the very beginning. If we look at the Treaty of Rome, which talked about equal pay for work of equal value, we are still so far from having achieved that. So we're excited to see in the programme proposed by the new Commission concerted action, for example, on equal pay, on violence against women, also a commitment to a future strategy. But that needs to contain and be supported by real political oversight. And Carina already mentioned the fact that the ministers for gender equality never meet formally. The ministers for sport meet at least 6 times a year. The ministers for fish, I've lost count. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't meet, but it says something when the ministers for gender equality never have a formal space to meet. So we need a strategy that binds the member states, because that says this is part of the core values of human rights and democracy of the European Union. And it ties us all together in that, no matter which country you're in.
Tiina, we're hearing a lot of goodwill towards the incoming commission, a lot of excitement, I guess, about the gender equal makeup of the team from der Leyen. The Commission already in the past has invested in gender equality, yet we see that the progress is really slow. So can you tell us a little bit about the Commission's plans starting November 1st? What are you planning particularly to change as opposed to the last round of, so the last 5 years?
Maybe just say first just a few words about this current Commission. Monica already explained it very well, but I'd like to highlight also the fact that there was work inside the Commission. So there was for the Commissioner Oettinger, he set the target of 40% in the management for women, and especially for middle management. And I think this was really important. I myself, I did not believe that would go so fast. So there was real improvement in that. And then as to the not having the strategy last time, this is true, and I still would like to say that we did not work. We did work, and we, for instance, got the work-life balance proposal through. So we are building on what we have been doing before. But with this strategy, we hope that we can take a bigger step. I'm a very realistic person, so for me it's difficult to talk about tiger leaps, etc. But I really think that we are able to put together a strong, ambitious strategy which would cover a lot of area. One of the very important area being the pay gap. And there we also had the action plan already during this Commission, and we are using that as a basis, but then going forward. And as you probably know, the President-elect von der Leyen has promised that in 100 days from the beginning of the Commission, there will be measures, legislative proposals, in order to enhance pay transparency. And of course, pay transparency is a bit like data. This is something that we need in order to change things. And we will see then how we combine the strategy and one part of it, which is the pay transparency. I think this will be kind of one of the first steps that we will be taking.
Mm-hmm. You said you're very realistic. Given these plans, would you expect a bigger increase, let's say when a gender equality index comes out, so when the next one comes out in next year or in 2 years, do you see a bigger increase than we have seen so far?
I'm realistic, but I'm also optimistic. So I do think that maybe at least more than 2%. Okay. So let's see.
Okay. It's a particular challenge because from now on the index will come out annually, so only you have 1 year to fulfill that. But
so I made it up to 4 without thinking of it. Okay.
Yes. Carina, I'm curious, as an organization representing youth and young interests, young perspectives, do you perceive that there is a noticeable difference between generations when it comes to this topic? Do you think that young people have this is obviously a general question, but I'm just curious to hear your take on that. Is there, do young people look at European institutions and just shake their head? They don't really know what's going on. Why is this taking so long? Or are there also strong, prevalent gender stereotypes noticeable with young generations as well?
I think one way we need to look at this aspect is as well that a lot of topics that previous generations were facing are still the very same ones that my generation is currently facing, ranging from power, being represented in formal decision-making, violence against women. So there's a lot of issues that are still very present, and these issues haven't changed as well, not for the younger generation. But I think what we definitely see as well, that the younger generation is way more open when it comes to gender. We don't have this binary approach in mind when we speak about gender. We notice it when we watch like Netflix, for instance, Queer Eye or other shows that are out there right now. I think that also show like how we as a young generation are also disrupting here and like are taking a strong stance as well and like making a strong point here as well on how we define gender as well, and that we stand for an open and inclusive society as well. So I think there we have seen a strong shift as well. But I think this is also has to do, for instance, with how we are growing up as well, having access to more information as well, being active, for instance, as well in youth organizations, which allows us as well like to learn from each other, to be more open-minded as well. And I think these are spaces where we need to further invest as well to ensure that we can continue grow as well and like reduce these inequalities that are existing. And that's why it's so important to invest in civil society organizations and allow us, on the one hand, to provide citizenship education on the one hand, but also like be active and be vocal when it comes to changing policies as well.
Before we continue, I'm curious, Mira, is there something going on Twitter worth
There's
noting?
actually a lot of buzz going on in
All
Twitter.
right.
I think people are reflecting a lot on the results, and there are many comments, mainly regarding their own home countries and what are the results and whether they're going up or down. So a lot of thoughts around there. But we also have one kind of more structural question here regarding the different roles of the institutions and the civil society, and whether this is an area which would need more attention, and whether actually this approach should be more bottom-up rather than top-down. Maybe you have some reflections on that.
I think it has to be both. It has to be top-down and bottom-up. And, of course, what we are doing, for instance, for the strategy, we have had a public consultation already on the engagement that we had. So what we need is a lot of information from citizens, NGOs, etc. So I think it is both. But you need the top in order to then have the machinery to get it through.
I mean, absolutely. When we just look at this Women on Boards directive that is in the chest of drawers for many years already, this is really this approach where it has to be also top-down. Because bottom-up, I mean, of course you need the pressure, but how should it work in an enterprise? So somehow when you just would like to change the hierarchies, the diversities, really to break the glass ceiling, it is really upon those who are in the political responsibility to have to act right now. So it really has to be both. And the other thing is, of course, everybody who is in the institutions, the Commission, of course, the European Parliament, all the time. It is absolutely not only important to meet and to work with NGOs, with all those fantastic people who are engaged in, but also to give the floor, to really to have the space in order to really work together. And of course, this will also be something for the next years in all the fields when it's about migrant women who are really suffering of so many inequalities, to take them on board, to listen to them. And therefore, it's also so important to have all these data. Just when you have the data, you have an eye opener, and when you get your eyes opened, it also allows everybody who is active really to do something. So it is really more or less a field to cooperate closely together and to do, of course, the legislation to have something binding in all fields.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. We know that the most effective way to advance equality between women and men, or the most effective indicator, is to have a strong women's movement, to have a strong and vocal women's movement, which includes women in all forms of life, in all kinds of places, and can include also women in institutions and politicians. But to have a strong and active and vocal, well-resourced women's movement is the fastest way to ensure that progress happens, because it raises the voice of women, it raises women's voices and concerns in all their diversity, out of the shadows and out of silence. And one example I'll give you of that is the work that we've been doing for more than 20 years now to shine a light on the terrible incidences of violence against women, the prevalence of violence against women. We were collecting data from our experts, from our observatory on violence against women for over 20 years, without the benefit of the resources that EIGE has or Eurostat has, trying to raise awareness about the prevalence of violence, about the structural nature of violence against women, about the continuum of violence against women in all forms of life. And that was coming very much from grassroots, from women working on the front lines, from women experts on violence against women, bringing that to the attention of politicians and decision makers, and eventually encouraging and making sure that the European institutions have started to take that seriously. And there again is something where we are very optimistic about this Commission and Parliament to see more progress at an EU level to really tackle violence against women as a structural issue in a much more strategic way. So we're still hoping to see the ratification of the Istanbul Convention by the European Union, and also looking beyond that to how we can strengthen all of the measures that the EU has in its hands to tackle violence against women. But it's an example of, I think, women's movements and frontline activists and women themselves in their own lived experiences, bringing that to the attention of institutions and making a real change.
But do you think we have enough of a European women's movement right now? My perception is, and maybe that's just plain wrong, that often feminist and other gender equality movements are very much focused on national context. So you obviously work on the European level, but would you hope or wish for more social or civil society activity on a European level, interconnecting, exchanging best practices across borders, these kind of things?
Yeah, and I think it's both are needed, right? So the way that civil society works is to engage right at the grassroots with people and the concerns that they have in their lives, and to bring that to the attention of decision makers in different ways at local, at national, and at international level. Certainly as the European Women's Lobby, we are going to be celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. And we bring together more than 2,000 women's organisations in all parts of the European Union, working on all the different issues that are covered by the index here. And we come together to campaign for our vision of a feminist Europe, which we've seen is far from having been achieved yet. So we have common campaigns, we have common calls, we have structures which allow our members to share and learn from one another. We also have structures to allow us to campaign in a common way. We did common campaigning messages around the European elections, for example, where there's both a national, and it's essential also to work at national level in an election campaign, but also to connect that across the European Union. But when it comes to the issues of the Istanbul Convention, the issues around pay, the issues around gender budgeting as well, which are incredibly important, we need to work together. We need to learn from each other, and we need to understand also what's working. So we know what works. We've heard here about quotas working to advance the participation and representation of women in democratic structures. We've also seen examples of what is possible. For example, the provision of free childcare in Malta. It is possible, and one country is doing it, and it makes a difference. So why not do it everywhere? That would have a huge impact. So it's important for us to learn from different parts of Europe, and yes, to build a common and a strong voice in Europe as the women's movement, but also to strengthen the voice at national and local level.
I think, Blandine, you have some points on this?
Do you mind giving me that?
You have your own mic too.
Oh, yeah, I have a mic already. Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to support Joanna's points about civil society movements, that the need for a strong women's movement, and to mention a different piece of work that we finished recently to analyze the progress made after 20 years of the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. And what we are seeing is that, probably due also to the austerity policies that you were mentioning earlier, there has been a shrinking of the space for civil society, alongside with shrinking resources, shrinking political influence, and especially for the women's movement. So I was curious to know if Carina and you, Joanna, you also experiencing this in your line of work, and if you have also found ways to counter this. Because we see the consequences of on-support services, especially when for victims of violence, and how those women's movements are hardly hit by public spending decreasing, political commitment also increasing.
I mean, I want to add to that the excellent work that EIGE did looking at the European budgets as well, and a really scandal, actually, that was revealed by your study on the amounts of money that are actually being spent from European taxpayers' money through the European budget on advancing equality between women and men and gender equality. Less than 1% of the big cohesion and structural funds. That surely has to be cause for concern for the European Parliament and for the member states as well as for citizens. And that's already a tiny amount of money going to the issues of equality between women and men. There is hardly any money going to actual women's rights organisations and women's civil society organisations. There is a lack of public money. We've seen but the money for public services, for example, violence against women, but also the kind of public infrastructure that supports working mothers, like childcare, after-school clubs, etc., being cut, has had a huge and dramatic impact on women and women's abilities, therefore, to also engage in civil society. We've also seen massive cutbacks to the funding, which was already tiny, to women's organisations. Many of our members, who are national councils of women's organisations in the EU member states, receive no public funding and have actually no full-time staff. That is the situation that we are facing at the moment. So the European Union does resource some women's civil society organisations through some of its budgets, but it's still a very, very tiny amount of money. And I think certainly some increased resourcing to grassroots women's organisations would be needed. As the European Women's Lobby, we've been working in particular to support our members in Central Eastern Europe, Baltic and Balkan states. We've got a task force that brings together those members. And there, very strongly, there's a concern being raised about the closing democratic space, the closing space for women's organisations, as part of a closing space for civil society more generally. And certainly the lack of funding available to those organisations right the way from the Baltics to the Balkans is really stark and a major problem, actually. If we want to put women's rights and gender equality at the core of the European project, we need to really invest in the women's organisations who will raise the alarm on that.
All right. Carina, do you want to add something?
Yeah, and I think we also see how severe the situation is when we look at the current multilateral situation. Recently, when Antonio Guterres was tweeting that the UN is running out of money, I think it's also like a strong signal. It's an organization, an institution working as well like strongly on human rights, and it's a sign if member states are not chipping in any money there. We've also noticed a very similar situation here in Europe. Recently, the Council of Europe was facing severe budget restraints as well. And this is the body here in Europe focusing on human rights, on the rule of law. And if this organization's institutions are at risk, I think it clearly shows as well in which direction we are going as well. And this is then again also reflected in the field of civil society organizations. And also we as European Youth Forum and our member organizations are facing similar challenges as Joanna was just outlining as well. We have member organizations who are not being legally recognized by their governments, which means that there is no formal way that they're being consulted. There's no formal way in how they're included in decision-making processes in the countries. It means that they do not have access to funding. It can be that if a grant, for instance, is not granted, that from one day to another they need to shut down, that they cannot continue working. But it's not only the legal recognition. Quite often what is missing as well is the political recognition, that when civil society organizations are being too noisy, when we are being too loud, that we are simply not invited to attend meetings, that there is political decisions where countries decide up to set their own representative structures, which are not representative, but which are in favor of the current political situation in the respective countries. So there's different strategies as well that governments are using in order not to bring civil society organizations on the table and not to include us. So there is a number of examples as well, what we see all across Europe. And I think it's not only in the 1 or 2 member states that are out there, but I think there's a number of member states where this is currently happening as well, all over Europe as well. And I think to bring like one very concrete example where the European Youth Forum was also working on, together with the Austrian presidency, we were working on council conclusions in the field of gender, digitalization and youth. And those council conclusions have not been adopted because they had a focus also like on LGBTQI and had like a non-binary focus there as well. And then there were member states who said no. And then this process was being shut down. So I think it also has like strong consequences in areas where we are being involved as well. So I think this is also like to showcase on how severe the situation is as well.
Mira, what's going on with our
Well,
audience?
there are a lot of things going on, but there was one question which I thought could be interesting to bring into this discussion, which is something that has been mentioned in the morning several times and also referred to by Tiina. And that's about the issue with stereotypes and how can we really tackle those stereotypes and get into the bottom of this issue, which would then lead into gender equality consequences throughout the line. And our follower on Twitter is asking that, does somebody have something concrete in mind? What can we do? What can we do to
concrete policy?
Concrete policy, something that would actually help in addressing the gender stereotypes?
I think this issue is one of the roots of so many inequalities. So, I mean, of course, we talk about the financial economic crisis and everything, but it's so many issues. When you dig in deeper, we always realize it's those stereotypes. And I think one of the most important things is to recognize them, to see them, to identify them, and also to take some of those stereotypes on board in order to compare them and to measure them. Because in so many cases, there is just this feeling left that there is something wrong. And many of us, even if we are dealing with caring, if financial independence, if all those issues where we try to find tools to fight them, part-time work or whatever, we don't come back to those roots of stereotypes. And what I would really like to wish, and we debated that amongst the coordinators in the European Parliament sometimes, we really wish to make them, to see them better and to compare them, to take some examples and really to compare and monitor what stereotypes are existing, and then to compare them and to take them more or less as a basis on drawing conclusions. I mean, I just say I was really working so much on women on boards, and there sometimes when we had it up and down, and there are so many reasons why the glass ceiling can't be broken. And of course we have the figures and we have the qualifications and we have everything as well-educated women. And then you see sometimes it's really stereotypes, not anymore child caring. When you look to Sweden, for example, where everything is given, it's stereotypes. And I think this is really one of those roots where we should, and therefore I'm looking to Virginia, to EIGE, we really should also work on methods on comparing several of them. What is happening in one country, what is happening in the other country.
I do agree. It's a lot about visibility. I think the women's movement from the very beginning has been about visibility. And again, I don't think there is just one action. If I look how we work at the Commission in general in this field, it's both specific actions, but then it's also mainstreaming. And if you bring things visible and then you try to mainstream it, it can be painfully low work, but it's very important. And one thing that I'd like to mention is that it was also mentioned in President-elect's political guidance that there will be a task force in the Commission to work on this. There's now been discussion on how the task force would look like. I cannot tell you exactly yet, but I think the main thing there is to try to make it also top-down, bottom-up, so that you have the political commitment. Because stereotypes, they are also about policy, but it's difficult because it goes into each one of us. So we have to make it visible and then work it. And I think it's like poem reading. You start from one place, you come to the end of the poem, and you understand it differently, and then you have to start again. So it will continue.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to equal pay for work of equal value, because that's what it says in the Treaty of Rome. And I think we haven't really unpacked the value part of that. We certainly haven't achieved the equal pay part. But what do we actually value in our societies, and where do we value the work that women do and the work that men do? I think we saw earlier in the statistics here about the issues of segregation, so segregation in the labour market, the issue of care and the unfair and overwhelming burden of unpaid care and care responsibilities on women, and the issue of pay as three sort of intersecting things at the heart of the inequality in the index. So I think we need to go back to thinking, what do we value actually in our society, and putting a value on care, putting a value on the work that women contribute and participate in, so that we actually end up with a society in which women and men are equal earners and equal carers, so that everybody participates equally and fully, that women are not seen as a kind of appendage to men in the labour market who also have to take responsibility for all the care, but actually we're doing a whole different approach to how we share care and work responsibly and fairly. That also means that there needs to be responsibility on legislators. There needs to be, we need to look at the measures that work to tackle those stereotypes which exist in the labour market and in the home, actually. We need to look, I think, at the long-term budgets of the European Union as well. So we are now in a process of discussing the next 7-year budget of the European Union, the multi-annual financial framework. The proposal that has been put forward is entirely gender blind. The European Parliament has last week reaffirmed its support for the previous Parliament's demand that a greater attention to gender budgeting, which is the most important and concrete way of putting into place gender mainstreaming, which is a treaty obligation as well. So we want to see measures put in place. We know that achieving equality between women and men takes long-term measures and long-term investments. We know that gender budgeting takes a long time to practice, to put into practice, but we need to start now. We can't let another 7 years go by with the multi-annual financial framework failing to address gender in its core. Thank you.
Tiina, I think you wanted to jump in.
Just a short remark that policy is about words, the words that we use in making policy. And I was a couple of weeks ago in Helsinki where we were discussing gender and economy. And there was somebody who made a very good point saying that when we build bridges, we call that investment. But when we talk about gender, we call that cost. And we should change the language here. We should say that equality is not a cost, but an investment.
That's a really good point. In just a few minutes, we'll also open the floor for questions from the audience. We'll probably not have time for too many, maybe 2 or 3. So I have one more question for the panel, but if you can already think of questions that you might want to ask. Unfortunately, we cannot include all of you, but just FYI. My last question for you, that's one I'm very interested in. We talked a lot about value stereotypes, investing rather than spending, these kind of concepts. But at the end of the day, we need to find ways to also engage men with this topic, because when I work on this, and I'm certain that's the same for all of you, there's usually way fewer men who attend these kind of events, who will read the index report, all these kind of things. Maybe I'm curious from the 4 of you, just briefly, have you found successful strategies to get men on board with this topic, to get them interested and excited about being a part of a solution? This can be personal or it could be a policy, whatever comes to mind on that. I'm just curious to hear some thoughts on that. Do you want to go first?
I mean, I really like to start with that very quickly, because it's always not only about women, it's about men and women. It's about a life in quality. It's about working. It's about living. It's about having children. It's about having power. And it's always the question, how to live that inequality. And the work-life balance directive was really an excellent example, of course, at a very modest level. I'd really love it to develop it further. But how we could better share. And finally, it's always the question how we do that. Democracy is also working better if men and women are participating in an equal way. I mean, I think I hope not only in this audience but everywhere we don't only have to explain that it's finally about the quality for men and women. And when I just look at the European Parliament, at the committee structures, for example, we also see when you go to the ITRE committee, there are more men in it. And when you're going to the FEMM committee, there are really far more women in it. And when we just see, well, when we talk to those men and those women who are the minority there, they always wish that it's in a more that it's working in a more balanced way, and that's the whole working life. That's the life in the European Parliament. That's the life in the political institutions. So somehow, referring to this work-life balance, we always have an excellent tool to convince, especially young women and men, but also the elder one, that it's about equality for all of us. And when we're just looking into the structures of young people today, they are interested, not only men working around the clock, around the clock, and women staying more with the kids. Somehow it's for both, and therefore I just see, when I just look at you, the younger generation, that also, especially younger people, are really learning that. But therefore we need the infrastructure and the tools that really the equality can be lived.
Some other thoughts on this, Joanna, maybe, or Tiina?
So I've got an idea. Some years ago in the European Commission, even though there were definitely majority men commissioners at the time, and majority men staff as well, there was an annual meeting of the commissioners that was hosted by the President of the European Commission to look at progress on measures across the different directorates and departments and areas of work of the European Commission on gender equality and equality between women and men. So I'd like to see the men, who are still the majority of the commissioners who've been proposed, let's not forget, being champions of that proposal of showing up with a really powerful commitment to gender equality in the domain that they lead on in the Commission, and to do that on an annual basis. So really reporting back and showing their leadership as men in positions of power for the whole of the European Union. I think that would be a really brilliant signal. So that's something that we'd like to see.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate that. Tiina or Carina?
Something that I've noticed when I say that there is a backlash, when I say that there's still not enough women in power positions, for instance, usually a response that I get is, but look, Germany or the UK, they had a prime minister or a chancellor, a female chancellor, for years. So it's possible, kind of like this is kind of like the narrative that often is then coming back. It's then always then being put the blame on the women's side. If they want, they can, because there are these great examples out there. So I was then reflecting about this, and then I realized when I start more talking about a vision of how I want to see society working, kind of like also in the line what you were just referring to as well, like what we want to see in the future, that this is for everyone, for every member of society, you get also like different reactions. And at the same time, you're also like part of providing a solution. And I think it's also like important of being part of this process as well, providing a vision, but also like on how you see it implemented as well. And also give everyone ownership in this process as well, to really ensure to have everyone on board. So I think quite often it has to do as well like with the narrative and how we are bringing messages across. If someone allows me to shape a process as well, if someone gives me the feeling that I'm included of a process as well, I'm more likely to contribute to this process as well, unless if someone is coming to me and saying, oh, you're not doing great, we need to change this. I might not feel like included and might not feel wanting to contribute to this. I think this is also a way where I see, or when I talked about more about the vision of how I see that things are improving as well and people feel more engaged as well.
Tiina, do you have some thoughts?
Just two very short personal reflections. when the Me Too movement started, I was really surprised when one of my friends, he's maybe about 10 years younger than I am, and he said that he was kind of shocked that he, for the first time in his life, I had also always considered him not maybe a feminist, but very kind of egalitarian person, that for the first time in his life, he saw that he had to think something about it in his own behavior. So what I want to say is that sometimes some kind of a movement can really change things and get also the men to see the situation. The other comes from my past as working for the Ministry of Justice in Finland and also with prisons. How do we help men who commit violence against women? It's not only about punishing them, it is trying to give them tools. And I think this might be a more general point, that instead of just saying you are acting wrongly, it is somehow to give the tools to think in a different way and to act in a different way.
All right. Thank you so much. I would turn to the audience. I see a lot of hands. I will see how many. We'll just have about 10 minutes. So I would ask you to just please just do a question. I know comments would be great, but we don't have time so much for that. Just say your name, which organization you're from. We start right here.
Thank you. My name is Dagmar Schumacher. I'm the director of UN Women here in Brussels. Congratulations to EIGE for the publication of the report. Just a few comments. First, we were talking about addressing stereotypes and social norms. I want to just refer back to an advertisement that was published last week in Brussels, in Belgium, from Bicky Burger, which was blatantly advocating for violence against women, of a man to a woman, only because she didn't buy him the right burger. I would really encourage you to look at that. If this kind of advertisement can be published in Belgium, in the middle of Europe, we are having a problem. And we have, of course, also taken a lot of measures to really make this public. Then 3 points why I'm also very, very optimistic. One is the new European Commission has very strongly focused on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. I think this is a really good step, also combining the external and internal. Secondly, the strong commitment to the gender equality strategy and the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, also in the EU's commitment to the G7, but also within the wording of the new Commission. I think this is really strong and very important, and we look very much forward to a very strong gender equality strategy. And thirdly, on the movement building and the opportunities that lie ahead, I think next year with Beijing Plus 25, we have such an unbelievable opportunity to really foster this movement building, to really foster the renewal of the commitment to the Beijing Platform of Action, to make it really also the platform for young people. So I really encourage everybody to be very strongly engaged in that process. Thank you.
All right. I think we'll collect a few points and then we'll bring it back up. Yes.
Good morning. Agnès Hubert from Gender 5+. There is one issue that, first of all, I want to sort of thank EIGE for this index again. And I want to thank the panel because, I mean, most of the issues have really been raised, and I think it's very important. And if we are sort of working together in this way, I mean, I'm sure we'll have more progress next year. There's one issue which has not been raised, and I'd like to sort of not maybe raise a proposal of some sort. It's the question of sort of anti-gender policies and populist regimes, which has not been raised at all. Probably there's some fatigue about it as well. But I do think that the former Commission has been very committed towards sort of trying to use the instruments in the treaty. Obviously, it's not done without the Council, and blockages are there. But we'll have to test the next Commission on that strongly as well. But my question is probably more than for Evelyn Regner in the Parliament. I was wondering how much it would be possible to sort of reinforce your cooperation with the democratic legislative bodies, with the national parliaments, in order to have a real monitoring of anti-gender legislation which are being prepared in some countries or which are sort of passed in some countries, and how that the parliament could play a stronger role in this field.
Mm-hmm. With the gentleman in the back who has raised his hand for, and I will unfortunately not be able to cover all points. We'll try as much as we can.
Hello, Regner representation of Northern Westphalia to the EU. I'm very sad about underfunding of Council of Europe, no doubt, and the United Nations, but I would like to mention the permanent underfunding of an institution which is quite important for the European Union, gender equality, and that's EIGE. EIGE is not furnished from the beginning with the appropriate resources in terms of staff, in terms of money. And now the question to the new Parliament, to the new Commission, is there any attempt to help them out, to do their work?
I think we'll bring it back on the panel first. Now we see who wants to tackle this. Maybe Evelyn or Tiina?
I just start with the last question with the EIGE budget. I just can say on behalf of the committee that there is on the committee in the European Parliament, there is a strong interest of the members of the European Parliament who are part of this committee on the proper work of EIGE, on the whole task. So somehow when we started our work amongst the coordinators, simply to tell a little bit what's happening inside, there was the question, so who will be the representative working closely with EIGE? And then it turned out more or less everybody. So somehow, and there is really a deep commitment, and now we installed a working group within the committee just dealing with the EIGE issues, and there's really a very strong commitment. And of course, one of the major questions is always, if you want to do proper work, you need the money. So I just can say on behalf of the members in our committee from different political parties, there's a strong interest to not only strengthen and support and to make propaganda also for the work EIGE is offering, because it's really absolutely valuable work, as we already said it right now, for all committees, and not only for the committees in the European Parliament, but also for the Commission. Concerning the question on anti-gender legislation, I mean, this is really an important issue. The European Union stands according to the Article 2 and 3 to gender equality. We have it in our values. We have it in our basic work and aims and goals of the European Union. And so of course, we also have to look very carefully what's happening at the national legislation. Of course, when I really have to say, one has to be also a bit, not cautious, that's not the right word, but I'm experienced in listening also to members of the European Parliament, national politicians, when we raise the issue, that there always pops up, but this is subsidiarity, don't interfere. We can do what we want at the national legislation. And of course that is wrong. And therefore what we need is committed members in the European Parliament who spit it also out, and we have really fantastic members in our committee who are also very active at national level, which is important to raise the fingers and to point at it. And we will make hearings, that's what is already planned, on several issues where we see it at the national legislation that there are things going wrong, which means a backlash for the whole development of the legislation in the European Union, also at the national level. And we'll do hearings and trying our best really to raise it in the given competencies. It's a huge issue because it's on the basis, it's really on the values of the European Union as such.
Tiina, do you want to say something on that? Or?
I will say something which will not make me popular. First of all, of course, the Commission is the one who proposes for the funding or for the budget, and you probably know that the negotiations on the MFF are going at the moment. The lines are the same as they very often are. The North wants to have more tighter budget, and maybe the South more lenient budget. And of course, EIGE is one part of that, within that. And then again, there are horizontal kind of rules or attitudes towards agencies in general. So as much as I would like to propose that EIGE has more and more people, at the same time, I would have to look at Eurojust and Europe, EPPO and all the others too. So things are not that simple, but I'm very happy about really the strong support from the Parliament.
Joanna? Or?
Yeah, I'll speak to a different point, one that was raised by Dagmar, about the stereotypes in advertising, actually. And I think it's true that it's not talked about enough, because it's almost become normalized that women are objectified as objects of sexual pleasure or other forms of objectification that happens through advertising. And it's such a huge industry, and it forms such a part of our landscape that we almost barely notice it. But I think it's one of the things which has impacted on the deepening of stereotypes over the last 20 years. And it goes beyond the advertising industry and the extreme example that Dagmar gave, to a more broad sense of hypersexualization of women, and particularly of young women, that is exacerbated by the almost universal access now to violent online pornography that seems impossible to stop, which is having an impact on the very human sexuality that we have. We object. As women, we object to being objectified, and we think men need to object to our objectification. That also stimulates a sense that men are entitled to women's bodies and to access them and to criticize them, which in itself is part of what's been revealed through the Me Too movement, I think. These barriers that exist in all our workplaces, our streets and our homes, because men feel entitled to comment on or grab women and their bodies. So we, as the European Women's Lobby, we've got our members from all over Europe in town actually this week to discuss strategies and collaboration around ending violence against women and sexual exploitation. We're calling it Women Object. So that's our hashtag for the week, but particularly looking at this area because we think it's an area also that needs attention by governments and by the European Union. I wanted to also say something about Beijing as well. So next year is as Dagmar pointed out, is the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, which is still for us one of the most far-reaching international instruments to advance and defend women's human rights. And we as the European Women's Lobby are certainly participating in reflections at national level and at European level, and we look forward to seeing the EIGE report on progress or lack of progress of the European Union towards the Beijing Platform for Action. It definitely creates, I think, an opportunity to mobilize interest, to mobilize women's groups, to mobilize politicians, to mobilize governments across the globe, to look at actions that are needed really to start accelerating the progress. We've seen here the progress is too slow in the European Union. That's reflected around the world. So it's time really, I think, to use that 25th anniversary next year to really build momentum and accelerate our joint action. So we're looking forward to participating in those activities next year as well.
Carina, do you have any concluding thoughts? Because we're about to conclude this panel. I just wanted to give you, if you had some last thoughts, you got those.
Well, I think in the current situation that Europe is finding itself, I think we need to build on investing also in civil society organizations, because we are the ones, on the one hand, where we provide spaces, where we can discuss strategies, as you were mentioning, where we provide education, where we inform the public, where we say, okay, this type of advertisements are not okay, for instance. So where we really inform the young generation as well, or all people in general, about how we want to see society as well, and also like to be critical about what is happening in our society as well. But for this, we also need the commitment from the political side as well, and to provide us with the spaces to ensure that these spaces can function independently, that they are safe spaces for activists, regardless of our opinions, So I think this is something that we need to look on and where we need to point the finger in the upcoming years as well. And that's why it's so important as well that now with the negotiations ongoing with the budget, that there is a strong civil society voice as well, that we have sufficient budget guaranteed for the upcoming years as well, that we can really work as well, but also that we are included when it comes to political decision-making as well, that we are not only consulted, but ideally, I mean, there would be co-decision making as well, where we truly have a say as well.
Great, thank you so much for this plea for really a holistic, cohesive effort here. I know there are more questions. Luckily, we have our break now, so I'm very sure we can continue the conversation with our panelists as well as with all participants. We've already eaten a little bit into the break, so I don't want to deprive you of even more. Before we close, I think, Mira, we have the reports available outside, correct?
We do, indeed. So now that we've kept this secret with gender equality score until the start of this session, now it's out. So we brought some bedtime reading, more bedtime reading for you, so you can pick it up from the table. And not only the report, but also we have the country fact sheet. So if you would like to look into what is the situation in your own country, you will find those as well. Of course, everything available also online on our website.